Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Hacking Visual Studio. My name is Kristensen, and today's topic is one that's really, really interesting because we're going to dive deep into a feature of Visual Studio, and we're going to go deeper than we ever have before on shows like these. We're going to figure out why the UX was done the way it was, what were sort of the issues, what can we learn from when we build our own extensions or our own UI for our own applications. And so I'm very looking forward to that. And I have a guest that's going to be, he's a real treat. He's got some real good information for us. So stay tuned for that. But before we do any of that stuff, we've got to say hello to our friendly neighborhood producer, James. Hello, James.
Hey, Mads, how are you?
I'm very well, my friend.
I'm excited. First guest ever. It's happening. It's all happening.
Today, first guest ever.
Yeah. This guest clicks even faster than I do, so I'm very excited about it.
That's right.
Yes.
Yep.
That's it for me. I'm out.
All right.
Okay, have a good show.
So let's just jump right into it, and let's start with the news. I love that sequence. Thank you, James. So this is going to be pretty brief, but you might not have heard that Visual Studio 2022 is now out in its release candidate. Okay, so you can read all about it on the Visual Studio blog. Amanda wrote a blog post about the release candidate, which is available right now. It has a go live license. You can write production apps using the release candidate. Okay, so that's a huge thing. That means now you can actually use it for real. Go get it. Thumbs up. Awesome release candidate. Also, November 8th is when the final version of 2022 is going to be released, the GA release. So another good date to keep in mind. And if you get the release candidate, that's going to update to the GA once that becomes available on November 8th. And there's a big launch event. We got a bunch of great content, presentations, sessions, talks throughout that day. And you're all cordially invited. And it's free, of course. It's free and virtual. And right here on whatever streaming service that you use. James, are we on YouTube only? Are we on Channel 9? Are we on Twitch? Are we on all of them?
Or on everything. Everywhere you want to be, we're everywhere.
Perfect. So that's cool. It was also announced that we have the Preview 5. So it says here Preview 5, the release candidate and Preview 5. So the Preview 5 is kind of confusing. Which one is the latest? Is Preview 5 the newest, or is the release candidate the newest? Well, Preview 5 is the preview of the first update of Visual Studio 2022, right? So that is the newest. That is what, if you've used to be on the preview channel, just like me, I'm always on the preview channel, and that's what I'm kind of always using. You want to just get Preview 5. That's going to continue you on the preview channel, and you can stay there and have a great time with that. So that is that's a difference between the Preview 5 and the release candidate. If you want just to get the stable builds or whatever, just get the release candidate. Okay. So with that out of the way, item number 2. I wrote a blog post, not necessarily newsworthy on its own, but a lot of people always complain that it's too hard to write extensions. So I thought, hey, let's advertise a little bit this new playlist on YouTube that we're building up. That's basically what this short little blog post is. It's just saying, hey, go over and check out this playlist on the Visual Studio YouTube, youtube.com/Visual Studio. And there's now a playlist called VS Fundamentals Extensions. And so it's a bunch of short videos, 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, that explains a thing like very precisely, and just one thing, like how do you do tool windows? How do you create extension packs? How do you do best practices? How do you add options to an extension? And a lot more topics are coming here for this playlist. And since you're watching this, you're probably interested in extending or using extensions, or you want to dabble a little bit, or just curious. And so you might have an idea of what type of video tutorials for extension authoring would you like. So let's hear it in the comments. You can also, tweet me or whatever. Just reach out and tell us what kind of videos are you interested in for extension development, for best practices, samples, and so on. Okay, that was the news.
You can tell I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready.
No, I thought that was good. Yeah, I should have warned you. I don't know. Hands up or something. Next time.
It's only our second episode.
All right. Well, enough of that. Let's introduce today's guest. Aaron, hello and welcome.
Hey, what's going on? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so Aaron, you're on the IntelliCode team, is that right?
Yeah, we work in Visual Studio and VS Code products.
Yep. And I'm looking at your background. Is that a real background or is it a virtual background?
It's a good question. It's pretty high quality, isn't it? I'm in the actual office today.
So this is the command central for IntelliCode in the Visual Studio Building 18.
Yeah.
In Redmond.
Yeah, that's the right place.
Looks busy.
It looks busy. Yeah. All right. So I miss Building 18. It's been a long time since I've been there. Yeah, it is technically my building too. That my office is in there. I just haven't been there for forever.
This is where it all happens.
Yeah, that's where the magic happens.
Remember when Aaron likes to close his tabs really quick?
Yeah. So that happened here again. Close the browser window. Poof, the studio is gone.
There we go.
Here we
How'd you do there, Aaron? Stop clicking.
All right. So, Aaron. So the title of this episode has to do with AI and machine learning, right?
Yeah.
So the AI engine inside Visual Studio is something we call IntelliCode. And what is it that you do on that team?
So I'm a product manager on this team, and I work with the team to kind of work with various data science and research teams to help productize what they've been able to discover. At the same time, we look at developer workflows to see if there are any gaps in their productivity that we can help solve with AI.
So you have a group of data scientists. Is that right?
Yeah, we actually work with two groups.
And they're kind of looking at sort of behind the scenes, what's possible with machine learning. What can we learn from looking at code, open source repositories? What can we learn from the body of code that exists in the wild? Plus whatever code that you're working on in your solutions or whatever, right? And then at the same time, they try to look at that. You're looking at, okay, what are some things that developers, they struggle with, or they could get a little help with if we threw some AI at them. And then you take the data scientist and you take your research and you put it together in a jar and you shake it, and out comes a new IntelliCode feature.
Yeah, that's roughly how it works.
Okay. All right. So how many people like you are sitting there and figuring out what people have a hard time doing using Visual Studio?
In this room, just me. But as I mentioned, we've got our IntelliCode core development team, and we've got 2 different data science teams that we work with as well.
Okay.
One of them is the pros team, and one of them is the dev data science team.
The pros team.
Yes.
What is the pros team?
So pros stands for program synthesis. At a very high level, it's about finding a program that satisfies a user's intent. And so pros is actually in a bunch of different Microsoft products, not just Visual Studio.
Is that what is on the GitHub Copilot as well?
GitHub Copilot uses a different model in their different team. But for users of Microsoft Excel, pros is also used in Excel.
Huh. So pros is used to figure out what the developer is intending to do, like while the developer is doing something or before they're doing something.
Yeah, I would say there's intent detection is an interesting problem. Usually it requires hints for us to have some context about what we think a developer or someone in Excel is going to do next. So things like maybe in Excel, you've seen this where when you start copy and pasting cells, you might see some great text that suggests the next ones.
Yeah, right. So we could do the same thing, right? So there's a feature in Visual Studio that my team added back in 2012, I think, which called paste JSON as classes. So the idea is that when you're in the C# file, and you copied some JSON content, you can paste that into a C# file, and it will analyze the JSON blob and spit out C# classes that represent those data structures. But it's a specific command. So for instance, what you're saying with intent, what if I were just to copy that JSON and paste it normally into C#? Could Visual Studio say, hey, you probably don't want to paste JSON directly into a C# file, so let me convert that automatically for you. I mean, or ask you at least if you wanted to. Is that type of what it is? Like, is it based on a user action like that, for instance? Or are you talking about more, I don't know, like more sort of just picking up subtle hints over time and aggregating that and making a decision based on what you observe the user doing over time?
Yeah, so it does. So hinting is a very interesting topic, and it really depends on context. So I'll pull up one of the demo videos from Excel, and I think this might be a pretty relatable example here. So here I've got on my screen. So it's clear in this context here that the user's trying to pull out the first, the capital letters here into column 2. And so there's always an input that's required in order for us to have an idea of the user's intent. And then we can start looking at output, what kind of programs will satisfy the user's intent. And that's going to differ depending on the context that you're in. Say, for example, for our output, some of what might satisfy a user includes something that might compile. So, if it's only acceptable if it compiles.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe another way to think about this is a program is only acceptable if it's semantically what a user wants. So there are a bunch of different ways about how we think about the input of the intent and what the user's doing, and what is acceptable in this output.
Wow, that must be actually a really hard balance. Because you don't want to be suggesting or hinting or something like that too much, right? Have too many false positives. That might be annoying.
Mm-hmm.
Is that balance act about that you're describing here?
Yeah, I think there's the quality of the experience, which is how annoying or how intrusive we are, and that's a balance. And another part is for the quality of the suggestions itself. If we're not confident in the quality of our suggestion, then we can't be intrusive about it.
Yeah, that makes sense. So the first feature that IntelliCode ever had was something inside the IntelliSense list, completion, as we call it internally, right?
Yes.
The completion list. They had little stars next to the completion items that the AI engine thought was the most likely things you were going to use from the entire list. And that was based off of machine learning, throwing machine learning at like thousands of GitHub repositories of .NET code, right? Or different languages.
Right.
But it was aware of context. It knew if you were inside an if statement or if you were like in a method body or whatever, and it knew the difference and it would suggest different things. So is that where the split between machine learning and AI comes in? Like AI is handled, it figures out context and so on, that lives in Visual Studio, and the machine learning model is something that we have supercomputers crunching the data on somewhere in the cloud, for instance.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think the way that we think about it is that there's kind of a couple main challenges here. I think one is obviously kind of learning from repositories that are available. I think kind of the second challenge then is kind of recognizing a user's context. And so you've mentioned kind of if statements, you've mentioned, but other things that we now look at include your variable names and their positions. You can also, based on the IntelliSense list, kind of steer our newly enhanced completions that we'll look at shortly. And kind of one constraint that we are constantly up against is performance. So all of the inferencing, so that's when you call the model and look for a result from the model, has to be done quickly because it's when you're typing. It's done as you type. Yeah. Every character that you type updates the model. And so depending on kind of the memory available, we sometimes have to reduce the context that we can ingest if we want to consider other types of context as well.
That's a really good point about performance, because a lot of extenders are really aware of they don't want to do something that causes bad performance, but sometimes it's like really hard knowing what to do. So how do you make sure that you're not hurting performance in these cases? Like, you have to do some work on background threads, or how do you do this?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I'm not quite as familiar with it on the product management side. But I would say that on a technical side, our inferencing, we use a runtime called Onyx, which dramatically helps reduce the size of a model in memory. And the other thing that we do is that all of these features are naturally launched as experiments. And in these experiments, we really keep track of the typing performance and other sorts of performance that our feature may affect.
When you say that you launch them as experiments, you mean you open the features to a few users of Visual Studio before you open it up to everybody to get all the characteristics of performance and so on?
Yes, that's correct.
That's a clever. Is that a Microsoft thing? Can anyone writing an extension do experiments? Do you know?
I believe this framework is a Microsoft thing.
But I guess everyone can just do it. Say, hey, I only like, and you can even just do a complete random, like 1 out of 10 people with my extension get this new feature that I've added to my extension or something. So you could do it sort of your own way. But it's a really interesting way of if you then have the telemetry to measure how your feature is performing on those users that do get it, then you can always open up for more. Is that something you've done with success for a while, or is that new? Or?
Yeah, we do all of our features this way, and I figure that extenders. So the way we do it is it's really just the setting. So for people in the control group, it's disabled. For people in a treatment group, we enable it. So I suppose if an extender has a way to just change the setting on a random number of users' computer and kind of collect the telemetry from that, I figured they should be able to roll features out in the same way. I'm not sure if they can get access to all of the same telemetry that we have access to, but yeah, certainly A/B rollout should be possible.
Yeah. Oh yeah, A/B rollout. Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, it's ONNX. Onyx is ONNX, right? There's no Y in Onyx.
Yeah, ONNX is correct.
Yeah. Okay, good. Oh, here's a question. Jose asked, can you talk about the differences between GitHub's Copilot and IntelliCode?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the GitHub Copilot team and along with the IntelliCode team are interested in kind of the same problem space. Our products are completely separate. And I think the key difference here is that GitHub's Copilot requires kind of a server to inference against, whereas IntelliCode's inline completions and suggestions, so all of our features work entirely locally on your machine. So none of your code will leave your machine if you're using IntelliCode. And so this is going to work on a plane if you'd like.
So that's a big fundamental difference in that you're 100% local. But the big machine learning model and all the training data and all this sort of stuff, does that then ship with Visual Studio that locally Visual Studio is able to query, or how does that work?
Yeah, so actually this has been one of the top feature requests to have the IntelliCode model ship out of the box in Visual Studio. And so I believe this is going to happen for Visual Studio 2022. And so if you get IntelliCode, you won't have to kind of download this model separately at install time. And so I think this is particularly important for users in kind of high security situations where they may not be allowed to kind of install additional extensions.
Yeah. People are working like defense contracts or whatever situation might be. It's actually more common. I hear about it way more than I thought I would. People that are like, they can't, their work machine that they develop on cannot be connected to the internet. I'm like, how do people work? Like, how do they copy paste from Stack Overflow if they can't?
Yeah.
But it's pretty common apparently.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised. It's been our number one kind of feature request for years, and yeah, we've got around to it.
So let's talk about that star. I mean, I think most people know IntelliCode from the star, even though they might not know the word IntelliCode. But the star that shows up in IntelliCode and completion, how many different UI things did you go through before you landed on a star?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's actually a bit before my time. So I'm not sure I have the full background story for that.
Okay.
But the completion's kind of an experience that's in the IntelliSense menu is actually an experience that is fairly novel as far as using it for other IntelliCode features. So we'll get to that when we talk about IntelliCode suggestions.
Okay. Well, maybe that's a good segue then.
Yeah, why don't we jump right into it?
Yeah, but hey, before we do that, actually, so the GitHub Copilot, you mentioned that it was different and it runs in the cloud, but it runs. My understanding is that a GitHub Copilot is very similar to like Visual Studio's whole line completion, but it can complete a whole method. So you start. So if you write C#, you would write like, let's say, public void insert GUID. Let's say my method name was insert GUID.
Yep.
It would then say, oh, the intent is to make a method that will insert a GUID or return a GUID or whatever. And they would then figure out that, and they would present that entire method for you, and you could just tap to commit that and put it in your file. Whereas in the Visual Studio, we just do one line at a time kind of thing. Why don't Visual Studio do the whole method?
So the way that we think about this is that inline completions is an improvement or an enhancement to the IntelliCode that users already use and love. And so, yeah, we think about it as an AI pair programmer that helps you out with up to that one line at a time. There are differences in the models. Again, they have developed a different product entirely separately from that we have. But again, running locally, that memory is really a constraint.
Oh yeah, right.
Yeah.
Do we? Is it something we're looking into? Do we want to have like that whole method completion or whatever in Visual Studio at some point?
Yeah,
does it not solve the problem? It's always. I feel like it's very often the case that people jump to a solution hypothesis. They go straight and say, "Hey, here's the solution I think will work best." But the fact is that often the problem might require a different solution that's even better. And so, but people might not know what the real problem is. So is the real problem that people don't know how to insert a GUID? Like, is it to save time? Is it because they don't know how to fill in a method? Like, programming is hard, right? So that could be another one. Or is it like they don't follow best practices? So can we give them code that follow best practice? Like, and depending on the answer, the solution might be different, right? And one of those solutions is Copilot. But that might not be the solution we're looking for in Visual Studio. I'm just guessing. But what's is that conversations you have, or?
Yeah, so I think you really hit the nail on the head with productivity. I think that's definitely something that's on our mind. And with productivity comes questions about cognitive load, which is also a topic that's very top of mind right now. And the reason for this is that on our team, at least, one thing we're always cognizant of is when we provide a suggestion, whether it's for a repeated edit or a quick action or an inline completion, is it actually going to take a user more work or more time to interpret and determine whether this is correct for them before they accept it? So are we actually making users more productive? It's a question that we think about a lot.
Right.
For us as a user continues to write that method, say maybe they define, insert GUID and they hit enter, we will continue to provide suggest inline completions for them as they write their code.
Yeah, right. Okay. So here's a question from Jose. Yes, which deep learning framework is used in IntelliCode and Copilot? Is it TensorFlow, PyTorch, MLNet, or
So I'm actually not sure about the Copilot side. Again, they've worked independently from us to develop their product. For IntelliCode, we actually have a article about the model that we've developed that I think will do a much better job of explaining this than I will.
Okay, so there's a blog post somewhere.
Yeah, I will dig up a link for that.
All right, we'll see. We'll see if we can find. James is probably already on it. He's really good sitting behind the scene here, and let's see.
The one thing that I will say about our focus here is that we're looking to bring inline completions to Python users shortly in VS Code. And so if you're a Python user or you work with a team that writes Python, please get in contact with me. We'd be really excited to get your feedback. I'm honored to get your feedback as we move towards making that a reality.
Awesome. Python. So you're going to onboard more and more languages to this?
Yeah, that's our focus. And well, that plus ensuring that we keep our C# developers productive is our focus at the moment.
Yeah. So is it so that when you've made a feature, when you've added like your AI magic for a new feature in one language, can you then relatively easily replicate that to other languages?
Yeah. So unfortunately, that's not always the case. So you'll notice that a lot of our IntelliCode features ship for C# first.
Mm-hmm.
And a big reason for this is not just because we want to keep our C# users very productive, but the other reason for this is that with C# we have the Roslyn compiler, and it provides very rich diagnostics to us, which then allows us to produce very high quality suggestions.
Yeah.
I mentioned the quality of suggestions earlier,
Mm-hmm.
and how being syntactically correct or not introducing additional compiler diagnostics code is important, and that's very rich information we have available to us in C#. It's not a luxury that we have in other languages today. So it is more effort to port to other languages to some degree.
That makes sense. I never thought of that, but that makes absolutely perfect sense. Are there any other languages that have something similar to Roslyn? Maybe not quite as good, but
we've been in touch with the C++ team and learning more about their compilers as well.
Okay. Yeah, because I know that they create like a big index for IntelliSense and all sorts of stuff. So they do have some sort of way of creating a whole workspace chunk of information that Visual Studio consumes. But you need to do it on like a huge scale, right? You need to do it on thousands of repos and
right,
and then make sense of it all.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So here's another question. This is kind of an interesting one. Can extensions change the completion suggestions? So maybe is this the inline suggestion? Let's do the inline suggestion. So that's the gray ghost text that shows up to the right hand side of the caret, the cursor blinking.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think that's something we support today.
So you don't support it from an IntelliCode perspective, but are you just using regular Visual Studio editor APIs? Like, could anyone produce that sort of gray ghost text?
So it's not currently an API, is what I'll say about that.
Okay, so you have to roll your own, like you have to do your own adornment.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
the gray text.
Yeah, so that's an intro text adornment if you have to do it. There's no direct API for that. So it's a WPF control you have to then inject into the editor.
Yeah, this is something that we built and is currently not an API.
Okay. Well, that's good to know. Maybe it will be someday, but at least if with most things in Visual Studio, if the Visual Studio team can do it, extenders can do it too, because we work with the same WPF app, right? At the end of the day, Visual Studio is just the WPF app, so and the same underlying APIs. All right. I think that was the first round of questions here. Keep them coming, people. Keep them coming. So, I remember when the whole line complete. I call it whole line completion. You call it inline suggestions. Did it change name?
Yes. So we're calling this inline completions just because it's not always a whole line.
Yeah, that's true. It could be half a line or like a few characters or whatever.
But it's always in your line.
Yeah, right. It's more accurate. Yeah, that makes sense. I remember in the beginning, and I think it came out. I don't know if that was internal previews or it was just in the previews, like in 1610, 16.9 time frame, when it was. You could see that you were kind of trying to get it right, and I assume that doing something like this, that it's hard to know up front when to get it right. You have to sit it, you have to live it, and figure out when it's too much, when it's too intrusive, or when it's too little, right? And you have to turn it up again a little bit. And I remember there was this one time where it would autocomplete, or it would suggest that I added a semicolon. So I'm done with my line basically, and it just suggests a semicolon. And I couldn't see whether or not that was ghost text, the gray text, the inline suggestion, or it was an actual semicolon. Just because one character wasn't that, was it gray or black? I couldn't really tell.
Right.
And I think I opened a bug back then just because that was. But you were kind of just trying to get things right, and so it improved immensely over time. But how much time do you spend on this type of like user testing, using it yourself, like dog fooding? Like, when do you know from your start, and then what to do and how, and then when you can stop and say, okay, now we've got it. Like, what does that process look like?
Yeah, there's a couple ways we think about this. Kind of, you were alluding to finding the best solution for a problem earlier, and so kind of we also start with the problem as well. And so a lot of the hero scenarios that we selected came from ASP.NET code bases. And so, Mark, my co-PM, would always be writing the same ASP.NET scenarios to kind of test the experience, see the quality of our suggestions, which we've improved over time. And so that's kind of one way we look at it. We look at how users use it, we think about the scenarios, and we test against those. The second way that I'm looking at this is whether the experience is a take back for a user. Say, for example, with brace completions. We don't want users to have to complete braces again because that's a take back from their current experience. A user hasn't thought about completing braces, or hopefully they aren't thinking about completing or making sure all their braces match too much on their own. And so our product has to be an improvement from the current experience.
Right, it has to be better than what was there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you talk about kind of the gray text, you not being sure whether that semicolon was a gray text or not. And that was also something that we had to test with users a lot, because code lenses are gray, but our inline completions are also gray.
So just for people listening, if you don't know what a code lens is, it's that little line of small gray text above methods and class names that says how many references you've got, how many unit tests are passing, and so on.
Yeah, so that's there are a lot of questions here. So something that came up in user testing is, not a lot of users use tab to accept something from the IntelliSense list, but sometimes some users will want to use the right arrow just because that's what they're used to. And so they're with something that's so in a user's flow, we're in a user's line. There's been a great deal of thought and respect put into all of the micro interactions in an attempt to be as unintrusive as possible. Yeah.
That must be a hard challenge. But so the user testing, like, how do you know when you've done enough user testing? Right. I think that's always the problem, because some users might tell you have to go that direction, and some other users might tell you the exact opposite direction. And so how do you know when you got it right? Do everyone have to agree that it's good, or is it okay if only some of them agrees, or is there a threshold to that? Or
you can't win over every user, but what we do find is that when you do enough studies, that the hypothesis eventually becomes, has strong evidence that it's true or strong evidence that it's false. Sometimes we see from users that, it's 50-50. And at that point, I think what that means is that maybe you're looking at the problem wrong. or you're thinking about the problem incorrectly. And maybe there's a solution that will make both of them happy if you look at the problem differently.
That is super interesting. So that's something that probably we can learn from all of us, right? No matter what kind of programs we're building. If we build something that splits our users like in half, that half thinks it's good, half thinks it's bad, that solution might need a complete rethink. Like greenfield that solution again, or go back and examine the problem. Is the problem the one you thought it was? And maybe start over. Man, that's scary.
Yeah, I'll give an example of this. So with inline completions, some users who used VS22 preview might have gotten an email asking them to fill out a survey. And in this survey, there was a question about quiet mode. And so for some users, our inline completions updates as they are typing. But we talked earlier about cognitive load. And for some users, this was actually quite distracting from them. Maybe they wanted a gray text completion when they were paused and breathing. So this is still something that we are exploring. Sometimes with a preview audience, we don't get quite a large enough sample size to have certainty in the actual result.
Yeah, that's a hard one. Sometimes what I do, if I don't really know, oftentimes I feel like I have a good idea if a certain feature is like done the right way or not. But then sometimes I just don't. But regardless, I just always ask my colleagues, like, hey, what do you think of this? Or can you try to complete this using my new thing? And it's, you can call it a quick pulse. You assess the pulse of just a handful of people, 2 people, but someone not you. And the more you can get, the better. But if you do 5 people and they're all like, yeah, this I'll use this, or this makes sense, or they give the same type of feedback, then you learn something super valuable that you can make those tiny adjustments and make your feature a whole lot better. But what you're talking about, you're probably talking about like something way bigger than that, right? You're using user testing in labs and all this sort of stuff. How small of a user testing do you do that, when you're developing features, even like when you're looking at designs before they implement it? And then how large scale do you end up doing them? Do you have like people in a big lab? Do you figure out where they look on the screen, all that sort of stuff, like by having like eye cameras and all that? Like where's the with the from and the to here?
Mm-hmm. I think there's kind of 2 ways to look at this. And so we find that these quick pulses where you're one-on-one with the user are excellent opportunities to dive deep into what they're thinking. Eye tracking is one of the techniques that we do when we invite people to the on-site labs at Microsoft. And I think that's going to be interesting to look at as we continue to evolve our thinking about cognitive load. So quick pulse is great for going deep into what a user's thinking and micro interactions. But there are some behaviors that you cannot predict until you actually have users use them. And so, we'll begin with having an internal dogfooding release to our team, and then sometimes to language teams that are familiar to us, such as the Roslyn team. And then we'll go from there. It's to some degree, it's kind of the chicken and the egg problem. You can't ask someone whether they're going to buy something and trust that answer until you actually put the purchasing decision in front of them.
Yeah. I remember that from business school. That was like one-on-one. You can't ask people how much they should want to pay for your product.
Right.
Yeah, that's impossible to get a true answer. Okay, there is so Jose, he's got another question here. How can we customize the IntelliCode suggestions? Like, is there any extensibility in the IntelliCode at all?
Yeah, this is so we've started with some base experiences. I'll have to double check what settings are available to the public. Since I'm always living in the internal builds here, I expect that with the suggestion space. So I want to be really clear with language here. So completions is when we're helping you author code. So those are the stars and those are the inline completions. Suggestions are when we help suggest edits to you, such as the suggestions for repeated edits,
Like
or
light
for
bulbs.
yes, or for the quick actions. So there's a lot of thinking that I'm really excited to dive deeper with you on.
Right.
That I expect that will allow users to customize.
Yeah, it's actually a very interesting one. So the suggestion. So maybe you're not able to customize the specific IntelliCode suggestion, right? But you can. But the idea of adding to your own stuff to light bulbs, you can do that today with just the standard editor APIs. Just to follow up with Jose's question here. So all the light bulbs, and we call them sometimes quick fixes or actions or suggested actions. And they have many different names. But that's just an open API that's fully documented. So you can definitely get in there. So that's one of the extensibility points, but maybe not so much other places from IntelliCode specifically. But that's okay. So let's actually talk about that for a little moment, because the suggestion seems to be very, very different in nature than the completions. The completions have to be right as you're typing. It has to be super fast. Performance is an issue, right? You can't slow people down from typing. And you can't be too annoying. They can't they have to still understand what they're writing. You can't take over screen real estate that confuses them or something like that. Whereas suggestions seems to be can come in a little bit later. It doesn't have to, it can be asynchronous. It doesn't have to be right as you're doing stuff. So what are the kind of different features? How do you figure out whether something is a suggestion and something is a completion?
We think about these as two problems. One is authoring code, so you're writing net new code, and we think about it as the second problem as refactoring code. And so that's where our thinking is about the suggestions. But we have heard some feedback that this language can be confusing to some users, and this is definitely something that's on our mind.
Okay, but the language, making a distinction between completion and suggestion, those two words?
Yeah, that's correct.
But do you think people even know, or does it even matter what we call things? Because one is a light bulb, and whether it comes from an AI engine or IntelliCode or Roslyn or a NuGet package or a custom extension, do you think that matters? Whether they know it from the AI engine? Does that, or is that just another provider of that type of functionality?
Yeah, to some degree, you're right. It doesn't matter. It's just the user sees something that Visual Studio tells them, and hopefully it's the right thing that they're trying to do. Whether it's our product, whether it's Roslyn, or something you find in a light bulb.
Yeah. Sometimes there must be a little bit of overlap, right? Because when does Roslyn, the PMs and the engineers or whatever working on Roslyn, they want to solve similar problems to you, with refactorings and so on.
Yes.
So how do you figure out what belongs where? Where do they end and you start on suggestions?
Yeah, so there's two ways we work with the Roslyn team. I think we all agree that it should be one experience, and that in an ideal world, the user just sees something that's exactly what they want to do and they can accept it. Now, as we work towards that world, there are some features that such as repeated edits, that use not Roslyn because it uses the Prose engine, but we also rely on the Roslyn compiler for diagnostics. And so as we move toward the fairyland where the user gets a suggestion for exactly what they're going to do next, this is going to evolve.
Yeah.
And some of these solutions that users see in the product, they're going to help with their intent, but they're not going to be the final form.
Right. Yeah. Because I think it can be hard to see the difference, or for users to they don't know if it's a Roslyn analyzer or if it's an IntelliCode suggestion, right? And maybe that's the point. Good design makes it all just native looking. It doesn't matter where it came from as long as it just gives one complete experience. Is that what you're aiming for?
Yeah, exactly. And in addition to being tasteful with our suggestions, we try to use existing UX paradigms when possible. Users, say for example, users know to look in the completions list, or they know to look in the light bulb menu, and they know to hit tab to accept already. So why reinvent the wheel if we don't have to?
Yeah. So it's about like playing nice with people's muscle memory. Don't introduce new concepts if none are needed, if there's already a paradigm that works and so on. I think that's a really good lesson for everyone working on any feature for Visual Studio, extenders or on the Visual Studio team in general, right? And that is something that we try to do, hopefully, all teams, not just IntelliCode.
Yes.
So what's coming for suggestions? What are sort of the next big what can I say, like technical challenges that you're going to look at? Like not necessarily just the individual feature, but like, are there some big problem spaces that are kind of new or?
Yeah, so with suggestions today, and this is going to involve the concept of certainty as well. So today we require users to make 2 similar edits before we suggest the third one in, third, fourth, fifth one, and help them apply all. But we would like to be more aggressive with showing, the suggestion when we have a high certainty. And some of this is, how certain are we that a user is actually doing a repeated edit?
Mm-hmm.
So maybe they're using like Control F. Maybe we give them a specific keystroke that they use to tell us that, hey, I'm looking for a repeated edit suggestion here. Because what if they're not? Then we've essentially given a false positive to the user. That's distracting.
But that's actually a really interesting problem, because I think we all have this with anyone that adds features to Visual Studio. Is how do you make the users aware of these features? Like, we don't want to put a big button in the middle of the screen for them to push, right? No one would like to have that. So how, in a subtle way, can we alert the user, get their attention to us without being annoying?
Mm-hmm.
That's back to that.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, that was it. It's just back to that same, like we talked about a little bit, but it keeps coming up. It's keep being something that I get questions about from extenders. And also internally, like, just, hey, we created a new feature, but how do we add discoverability to it? And that's just a really hard one. And I know that you and Mark and the team, you've had like some challenges in the past with making people aware of your completions and your suggestions, right? Both of them. Yeah.
So with our suggestions, so version 1 that came out in like 16, I think it's 16.4, 16.5. The user would see kind of a couple of dots, gray dots under their line of their code line. And if you moused over it, you would get a light bulb that you can then click and accept the repeated edit suggestion. And so what we found is that users actually were thinking about their line of code and weren't looking to the left. And so when we put the same repeated edit suggestion in the IntelliSense window, I think we 10x their usage.
Wow.
Just because that's where users were looking and thinking. So kind of being in flow is, really.
Did you experiment with that as well to see before you open it to everyone? Did you experiment on a small group of people and measure the difference?
Yeah, our lead developer, Peter, was kind of convinced that users would be very mad at us for being in the IntelliSense window. But kind of from this limited rollout, we discovered that, it was actually very well received.
Wow. Yeah. So if you out there on your extension have a feature that people are not using enough, they would love your extension more if they knew about this one feature. Maybe experiment with like different ways of showing it. You might be surprised at what works, and it might be like 10x is a significant improvement.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Another example of this is we recently launched suggestions for quick actions. So, if there's a Rosslyn quick action we think you want to use, we suggest it in the IntelliSense list.
So
and
this is a light bulb thing that you now suggest. Like, you call it quick action, but it's what shows up in the light bulb, right?
Yeah, something from a light bulb that we suggest in completions. So we support 2 of them right now. One of them is generating a constructor, and the second one is adding a parameter to a constructor. Yes. And
Those
this
are
is,
nice.
yeah, they are. But the challenge with these ones and discovery is that for some users, this is such routine code that they are not even looking in the completions window, in the IntelliSense window.
Right. Like for me, generating a constructor is like I just type ETOR and then tap, because it's a snippet and it does it for me.
Right.
And so I don't even look at the completion list.
Right.
Okay. That's an interesting one.
It is. And so, repeated edits very much was our first stab at this with suggestions. So it's kind of, it's local. It starts local to your cursor. But as we start producing suggestions or supporting quick actions that become, multi-location is a challenge. Edits and deletions are a challenge. Adding parameter and generating a constructor are both code insertions. They're not code edits or deletions. So those patterns are actually a much more difficult challenge that we are working on, and much more difficult to strike this balance of, intrusiveness, certainty. And, I'll be excited to kind of share the process that we went through in a future podcast when we have some answers.
Yeah, right. You mentioned another thing a couple of times is that you use options for a lot of these A/B experiments you're doing.
Yes.
And I've noticed that if you go to tools options, the IntelliCode dialog is quite long, and I think internal builds might be even longer because there's some internal only visible things. But do you feel like, or do you even know if people go in and they change any of those settings?
Yeah, this is the way that it is right now is not something we're particularly happy with. I would expect that in future builds of Visual Studio 2022, that we clean up these settings in a way that a user can actually understand what it does better than it does today, and have a better idea of what changing it does.
Okay. So do you think but do people even see that settings page exist? Like, do they even go in there and notice it? I guess that's harder for you to measure in telemetry and all that, but
it is, yeah.
I'm just wondering, because we've always known that people don't really change settings, and that's if you build a feature and it's not on by default and it requires you to turn it on in the setting, no one is going to turn it on. Why even build that feature to begin with? And so we've actually struggled with this internally in Visual Studio sometimes, where when we build a feature and we think, okay, not everyone wants this, it's gonna not be for everyone, let's not enable it by default. And it's like, well, what was the point then, right? Because no one's going to find that setting. And I'm just curious if you had any thoughts or any experience with settings, and how to make more people aware that they exist.
Yeah, just in general, there are a lot of features in Visual Studio and a lot of settings available. The one thing I will say about settings is that oftentimes you'll see different behavior from preview users, and compared to your stable build users. So that could be a way to kind of get earlier feedback or more engaged users that might actually go into your settings and play around with those.
Yeah, so preview users might be more like tinkering around, playing around, clicking buttons, see what's available, more so, relatively speaking, than the general population of the release channel.
Yeah, speaking of settings, with kind of the quiet mode, I noticed that a user in the comments mentioned that they actually use it. There have been we actually have a button in the bottom left of some preview builds that allows users to easily disable or enable the line completions or the quiet mode. But there were a lot of Twitter threads that we had to reply to, just telling the user that even without going to the settings menu, that they had a way to quickly edit the IntelliCode behavior.
Yeah, right. I noticed that thing showing up. It's down in the margin, just next to the horizontal scroll bar, right? There's a little icon that you click it shows a little menu, and you can.
Yeah.
Is that final, or is that coming out to everybody, or is that just you're playing around with things?
I think that's something that we were experimenting with to see if one, users would see it, and two, if they would use it to toggle the behavior. I think given the number of Twitter threads I've replied to telling users that we have something here, that it hasn't been very well discovered.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting because I used to think that was a great extensibility point of the Visual Studio Editor, was that you could put like whatever UI element, like whatever WPF control in next to the scroll bars. You can even put a whole new margin on the bottom where you can have glyphs and all sorts of things. And maybe they're not as discoverable as you might think they are.
We have those settings at the bottom of the IntelliSense window. I think there's one or two IntelliCode related ones. And from what I've seen, the usage of those is quite low as well.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, settings is a really hard thing to get right. And I've noticed that when I get the most use out of settings is when I have an entry directly to the settings page from somewhere that's easy to discover. And so we just did this. It's in the RC of Visual Studio 2022 with the preview features. So I don't know if anyone out there knows this, but Visual Studio ships with a bunch of preview features that you can enable if you want to. And so if you go to Tools Options, there's something called, under Environment, there's preview features. And there's a whole list of a bunch of checkboxes with descriptions of, what are the different features that you can enable. But we just found out that not enough people use those. And so we don't get that amount of feedback that we would want early on. That's the whole point of having preview features, is that we can learn about people using them. And so we did something very, very basic. And that is that in the Tools menu, where it says Get Updates and Components, or something like that, the very top menu items under Tools in Visual Studio. Now there's another one right underneath that says Manage Preview Features. And that just opens that Tools Options page directly. You just go in there. That's it. And so we don't know the result of this yet. We're kind of also just trying things out, right? But just, so if you out there have some settings pages that you need people to be aware of, make it easy for people to find it. Don't rely on them going to Tools Options. It just, statistically, we haven't seen it ever work. So, and now the IntelliCode team is in the same boat here, it looks like. Yep.
Yeah, nothing different on our side. We are encountering the same problem.
So what about F#? Are we getting some IntelliCode for F#?
That's an interesting question. I think right now we're very much focused on Python side on VS Code. Definitely something that we've seen some of and are thinking about though.
So does that mean C# and Python? What about C++ you mentioned, and JavaScript?
So with VS Code, the inline completions, we're excited to be working on something for our Python users and TypeScript and JavaScript. So that's the primary focus right now.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that makes sense. It's okay. So here's another question for you, and I'm not sure I know what this means, but maybe if you do, you can explain what the question is before you answer it. Could you talk about your tests using LSTM and RNN? Do you know what it's referred to here?
Yeah, so these are machine learning techniques. LSTM is kind of long and short-term memory. RNN is a type of neural network. And so these are great questions for a data science team. I actually don't have the answer to this.
Okay. Well, thanks anyway, Jose, for that question. It was worth a shot. Absolutely. Okay. So, Aaron, you've been on the team for a while. And I've seen since the inception of IntelliCode just how different it is and how the thinking of it and how many more members of the team there now is. Like there seems to be a huge effort going on, and it has been accelerating over time and so on. What are kind of the thing that has you most excited about IntelliCode in Visual Studio at the moment?
Yeah, I think with IntelliCode and Visual Studio, I'm really excited for kind of two things. One, in November, when the VS22 launches to the general public, I'm very excited to see what the feedback for inline completions is once the general public starts using this. I've mentioned some very different behavior between preview and stable audiences, so I expect some of that for inline completions. The other area that I'm very excited in is to innovate with our suggestions for quick actions and for repeated edits. Sometimes in our day-to-day as developers, we don't quite have the time to learn new features. In fact, most of the new features I learn are because someone I knew had shown it to me. And this is something I hear a lot in our quick pulse studies. So I'm excited to kind of take some of these quick actions that users may or may not be aware of and help them become aware of it. So there's kind of a symbiosis here. Maybe they discover, oh, there is a quick action for this. And maybe they'll use that light bulb menu more to see what other quick actions there are.
Yeah, that seems like a really interesting thing. And does that have to be with the code editor only, or could that be any aspect of Visual Studio?
I think discoverability and tipping is always something that we are thinking about and experimenting with. And that's not just the IntelliCode team. There's a broader effort for Visual Studio team all up to think about this as well.
Yeah, right. Yeah, because there's what do people do in there? What we call the inner loop, right? It's like debugging. Like how could you be a better debugger? Is there something AI can help with while debugging, for instance? I'm making this up, right? I'm just debugging, unit testing. Can the AI engine write better unit tests for you, or somehow make the unit test experience better or more hardened or something like that? Are you looking into other aspects like that?
Yeah, so actually for unit testing, we are repeated edit suggestion is actually something I've used a lot when editing unit tests or updating them or refactoring them. And it's kind of, very similarly structured code to some degree. And, it's the repeated edit have saved me, half hour before, because it finds all of the locations for you. You can, in one place, quickly review and see whether our suggestion is precise. And, I'm sure we've all run into scenarios where, we copy paste and we change one token wrong. Or say we did or we forgot to update one location and then it doesn't compile.
Yeah.
Or it doesn't run.
Okay, so let me throw something else out there. What if I am in a debugging session?
Mm-hmm.
Can the AI engine figure out the diagnostics of the running app and give me suggestions on improving my code? Like sort of like profiling, but just like kind of automatic and using AI to make it even better.
Huh, that's interesting. I haven't thought much about the debugging space, but now that you've brought it up, I'm going to spend some time next week and think about this.
I'm just thinking it's one of the things that Visual Studio does better than probably anyone else, right? It's like like we're just really good at debugging, and it would be like just take it to the next level. If I don't know, I just like tinkering about like things, I guess. And I think a lot of the viewers here who build extensions like that type of thinking, right? Because it's not always obvious what it is that people have issues with or where you can improve things for users. But once you find it, it feels good, right? And you can write that extension, you can get it out there, or you can tweak Visual Studio to make you even better or whatever, right? Faster.
To some degree, for the same problem, which is writing code that may not be the best practice or the best way to do something, I wonder if inline completions users are going to see something that works and might be a better practice. Or maybe I could get feedback after launch that, hey, inline completions is suggesting something that's like a a dark pattern or not the best practice or something. It could go either way. I'm really excited to see what kind of feedback comes in.
Yeah, that is kind of funny because the inline completions or any suggestions is based on that is based on the GitHub repository machine learning model, right? Is based on common practices, not necessarily best practices.
Right.
Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. I will say that we use a different data set than the Copilot team. So it's kind of different training data sets. And so it's not shared with the Copilot team for IntelliCode completions.
I remember when IntelliCode came out with the star suggestions, and I'm like, man, nothing shows up for extension authors, right? Because there was no repository scan that had extension code in it.
Right.
So I worked with, that was Mark at the time, Mark Wilson Thomas, your co-PM. Yes. And I gave him a whole list of like many repositories that had extension code, and it all got indexed, and we have it today, right? So it's there. So is that something everyone can do? Like, what if I have a NuGet package? Can I make sure that the types in my NuGet package shows up in whoever consumes that NuGet package's star suggestions, for instance, or inline completions for that matter?
Yeah, so this is, I'm really glad you brought this up because there's 3 things I have to say here. The first thing is that for users of Visual Studio 2019, there's something called team completions, where you can actually train a model on your code base. And so what that does is that it provides us coverage where we don't already have, so for most code, you'll have the IntelliCode model, and then you can have the completions model also trained on your code base for the stars. The other thing that I will mention is that in Visual Studio 2022, we have something called the deep re-rank model. And so it's an improvement on how we rank methods for stars. And in some scenarios now, we will actually rank custom types that you have written in your code. So we're not entirely dependent on open source repositories anymore.
Interesting. And that all runs locally and all that stuff?
Yeah, that's correct.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So what is the difference between, if I manually train, like team completions, I manually train a model based on my code base that I have, like the solution I have open. It's right. That's what it is. I train it on my solution.
Yeah. You train it on that solution.
Project or whole solution. Okay.
Yeah.
So what's the difference between that and then what you're mentioning in Visual Studio 2022, where it automatically does some things without, I don't have to train it? Is that what it is? Or
yeah, so for the team completions model, your solution gets sent to a web service that we've got, and then I believe we attach some information to that repository. With deep re-rank, you don't have to do that manually. It will just work. Now, it doesn't rank all of your custom types, but in some scenarios, it will rank them.
So again, it's like if there's high enough confidence, then it ranks those types. Otherwise, it doesn't. It stays away.
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay. Man, that's good. So it just keeps getting better and better. Is that going to be in? Is that in the RC today? Can people get this today?
I believe so. Yeah.
Oh.
I think we've had it enabled by default since preview 4, preview 5.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that answers the question of if it's not indexed from public GitHub repos, but it's trained somehow either manually or automatically on your own solution code base. But what about if I provide a NuGet package? Can I attach like a training model? Say this is how people use my NuGet package most, or here's how I suggest you use my NuGet package. My types, or is that even not maybe that's not even a problem that is worth solving or something like that?
I don't know if I would say it's a problem not worth solving, but for sure, I'll take this back to our team and see if something like this is feasible or feasible to implement. Yeah.
I'm just thinking for smaller NuGet packages, they might never be indexed, right? Maybe they're like such a small niche that they're never really going to be like critical mass. I don't know. Yeah. But just like a NuGet package can ship its own Roslyn analyzers to like help refactorings and all sorts of stuff.
Mhm.
I'm just wondering if there was something that could help, like editors for completion perspective, completions and suggestions, basically.
This is a very interesting. Yeah, so this is the third point I was going to make.
Okay.
So one hypothesis that we have is that, say for example, there's a custom NuGet package that doesn't see a lot of use, but maybe a development team that writes very similar types of code all uses that NuGet package. So one question that I've been thinking about is, is there a way to base or learn some suggestions from what some of your teammates are writing? That's
Ooh.
something that's very top of mind for me.
Right. So based on the behavior of your team members
Yes.
or open source contributors or whatever, however we want to define a team, I guess, can we augment your experience writing code
Yes.
for the better?
Yes.
Oh,
This is something that our team has been thinking about. And yeah, again, the hypothesis is that there are going to be some very specialized scenario that is specific to your team and the code base that you're working on. So how do we kind of help communicate that to the rest of your team?
So if we abstract the code base away from this thinking and just think like behavior, right?
Yes.
So if my colleagues or my team members use certain extensions that make them more productive, let's say, wouldn't it make sense that those extensions are recommended to me as well? I might not know about them. Like, is that the like, this is nothing to do about code base. It's just behavior, team member behavior or whatever. Does this fall within like your charter? Looking at, I know the word code is in IntelliCode, but could we rename the team?
Well, the team responsible for kind of the NuGet Explorer has started recommending packages. Like the stars don't belong to us; that belongs to them, but they're there, and so that's actually highly interesting. Maybe extensions could be recommended in the future as well.
But is that even something that's like, is that your team even like ever going to look at that, or are you focused completely on sort of code analysis and whatnot?
Yeah, I think code authoring and code refactoring is very much where our mind space is at.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe we shouldn't expect something there on that sense, but that doesn't mean that there couldn't be some other cool things for extenders in this whole space. And it doesn't have to be machine learning or AI, right? For it to be intelligent or smart or suggesting things, we don't have to always go and do these big training models and so on. There are things we can do, just simple behavioral recordings and yeah.
And this is, wow, yeah, no, you've changed the way I look at this, because it's very much the same problem as discoverability of features. How do I discover extensions without someone showing it to me?
Yeah, right. Yep. Extensions or I don't know what else. Maybe the audience can come up with ideas where, if you think about it out there, are there things that your colleagues do that you can learn from? Something that has to do with whatever they do in Visual Studio, whether it's writing code, the way they unit test, the extension they use, some techniques. Do they use a different Git workflow or something like that that could be suggested, or that could be, Aaron, we had back in the day, we had like this idea of like the thinking IDE. And the notion was, how can the IDE always be one step ahead of you? Like understanding your next move before maybe you even know it, and then suggest to you what that is without being annoying. That was kind of the elevator pitch, and it kind of didn't go anywhere. And IntelliCode kind of became that eventually, right? Or it was not an original idea. Like that idea has existed for years, I'm sure. But this is really cool too, because IntelliCode brings that thinking aspect to the IDE experience. But thinking can be about so many different things, right? It's really like so many doors are open here. Okay, there's another one from Jose here. What about Rust? Is that supported by IntelliCode? Is it hard to do because of Rust borrowing rules? I don't know anything about that.
Yeah, I can't say I've looked into Rust recently. Something I can bring up next week with the team.
Okay. All right. Cool. So I think we went through the questions. So if you have any questions for Aaron, now is the time, everybody out there. Anything related to the AI and machine learning that we have in Visual Studio, or suggestions to, well, suggestions, no pun intended, suggestions to other aspects where IntelliCode and like a thinking IDE might help out developers or such as yourself, we'd love to hear it. So here, in Aaron, with the 2022 release, like right around the corner, what in IntelliCode are you most excited for? People you think they're going to change their behavior, to see that behavioral change? Any of the features there?
Yeah, with inline completions, I have noticed that sometimes and we can demo this in a little bit actually, is that sometimes when creating my class, like if I type, public string first name get set, I hit enter, it's going to suggest public string last name get set. Like programming to some degree in some scenarios, it's become hitting tab, and I'm used to hitting tab. And so what we're trying to do here is help our developers, type less and code more, stay focused on the code where they really have to do thinking and not keystrokes that they really don't have to type.
Yeah, I've noticed that with myself because I've seen that exact example. I've done that. I'm like, whoa, but I was already about to type the next thing. So my muscle memory almost stopped me from getting that productivity boost of just hit tap, right? And the whole thing is completed because I'm just typing. I'm not even looking. I'm just typing full speed, right? So maybe the behavioral change is like look more closely to the screen while typing or something.
Yeah, in our Keynote in the code base, I used the eShop on web code base for our Keynote demo. And at some point when I'm writing this, I think it's a set password method, I have to deal with I believe an email and a phone number or some related thing, but it's a very similar pattern. And so by the time I got to the second one, it had picked up kind of how my variable names and methods were related in the first type of content info, and it was just hitting tab for the second one. So I'm really excited about that. I think suggestions for quick actions, we started with generate constructor and add parameter, but I'm particularly interested what our audience members or other C# developers would like to see us support next.
Yeah. So everyone out there, let us know in the comments below or in the live chat if you're listening live here, and also reach out to Aaron or me on Twitter or Visual Studio on Twitter. You're always welcome to do that. And I think James, you're still with us. I think somewhere. I think we're at the end of the show. And Aaron, thank you so much for coming on. This was so insightful. I'm really, really happy you had the time. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So everybody listening, this is sort of when James and I, we talked about bringing people on to kind of do deep dives. This is kind of what we had in mind, like learning about the implementations of various features in Visual Studio so that we as extension authors or hackers of Visual Studio can learn from that and maybe apply in our own code bases, right? So if this was cool, if you'd like to see more of these types of deep dives with like technical PMs or engineers, then let us know in the comments, okay? Important stuff. And if you don't like it, we want to hear that too. So keep that feedback coming. And with that, it is time to say goodbye and see you all next week.